My older brother slept with my fiancée 2 weeks after I proposed to her. When he told me, he laughed about it. When I was growing up, my brother made sure I never forgot that he was the best son in the family. Jake, 3 years older than me, was the golden boy, the fastest runner, the smartest student, the one who could charm relatives with a quick-witted joke or a polite thank you. And me? I was just a quiet, clumsy kid trailing in his shadow. At every family gathering, Jake would seize the spotlight, and it was almost like I became invisible. My aunts and uncles would pat me on the head, smiling as they said, "Why can't you be more like Jake? He's so good with people." Even as a kid, I could feel the sting of their words. The comparisons weren't limited to personality. Jake was an athlete, captain of the school's soccer team, MVP of the baseball league. I can still remember the summer when I was 9 and decided to try Little League because Jake made it look so easy. I struck out every time I stepped up to bat. Jake, standing on the sidelines with his friends, would laugh loud enough for me to hear. "Guess sports aren't your thing, huh, Squirt?" he'd say, grinning as if he hadn't just crushed me. The coach benched me after the 3rd game, and I quit soon after. School wasn't much better. Jake was a B+ student at best, but he had a knack for making teachers love him. I, on the other hand, was the shy kid who struggled to raise his hand in class. When my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Winters, handed back our report cards, I was thrilled to see my first ever A in math. Jake saw it too. "You got an A? What, did they lower the standards?" he quipped, loud enough for Mom to hear. She chuckled, brushing it off as harmless teasing. It wasn't just Jake who made life difficult. My parents, especially my mom, adored him. "He's a born leader," she'd say proudly, watching Jake charm yet another adult into agreeing with him. Meanwhile, I could hardly get a word in without being told to speak up or try harder. It wasn't that my parents didn't care for me, they did in their own way. But Jake's shadow was so large, there was barely any room for me. As I got older, the comparisons became less direct but just as painful. By middle school, Jake's reputation was practically cemented in our small town. "Your brother never had problems with his grades," a neighbor once told me after I asked for help with my science homework. "You should ask him for tips." It wasn't advice. It was a reminder that even when Jake wasn't around, his shadow loomed over me. High school was when the bullying turned sharper. Jake, now a senior, was king of the school. He dated the head cheerleader, got invited to all the parties, and of course, won homecoming king. My freshman year, I tried out for the debate team, a realm Jake hadn't touched, and made it. For once, I thought I'd carved out a space of my own. Then Jake showed up at one of our practices, just to check things out. Within weeks, he was flirting with the team captain and getting invited to tournaments. He didn't even compete. He didn't have to. His mere presence turned what had been my small corner into yet another arena where I couldn't measure up. I could tell my parents were proud of Jake, even if they rarely said it outright. My mom had this annoying habit of bringing him up during family dinners. "Jake's coach says he's got real potential," she'd gush while I poked at my mashed potatoes. "You should go to his game this Friday, Daniel. It might inspire you to stick with something." I tried to brush it off as best I could. But hearing my aunt say, "Look at your brother, he's what you should be like," at yet another Christmas gathering was enough to make me want to scream. Instead, I just nodded and went to help clean up the plates. It wasn't until college that I finally escaped his grasp. College was the first time I felt like my own person and not just Jake's little brother. I got into a state university a few hours away, and the distance felt like breathing fresh air for the first time. No one knew about Jake, and no one cared. I introduced myself as Daniel, not Daniel, Jake's brother. I made friends who valued me for my humor, my ideas, and my own personality. I joined clubs, aced my classes, and even started dating. It was in college that I discovered I was good at things Jake never even tried. I became the president of the Student Business Association, landed an internship with a promising tech company, and found that people actually wanted my advice. For once, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I was building my own future. Jake, meanwhile, had peaked. He went to a nearby community college but dropped out after a year, citing bad professors and lousy classes. He moved back home and bounced from one dead-end job to another. My parents never pressured him, instead, they coddled him. He just needs time to find himself, Mom would say whenever I visited. I kept my opinions to myself, grateful for the growing gap between our lives. College wasn't just about freedom, it was about transformation. I learned to stand up for myself, to speak confidently in meetings, and to pursue the things I wanted. By the time I graduated, I was already leagues ahead of Jake in terms of ambition and stability. After college, life only got better. I landed a great job at a tech company, started climbing the career ladder, and felt like I was finally stepping into my own. And then I met her. She worked in a different department at the same company, and from the moment we started talking, everything just clicked. She was brilliant, with a sharp sense of humor and a kindness that felt like a warm summer breeze. She challenged me in ways no one else ever had, and I loved her for it. Our relationship grew naturally, like it was meant to be. We spent long evenings cooking together, sharing stories from our childhoods, and dreaming about the future. She made me feel like I mattered, not because of my achievements or potential but because of who I was at my core. When I decided to propose, I went all out. I planned a sunset picnic at the park where we'd had our first date. I hid her favorite flowers under the blanket and practiced a heartfelt speech that I could barely get through without choking up. When she said yes, it was like the world had finally given me something completely untarnished, something that was all mine. Introducing her to my family was another story. My mom adored her immediately, commenting on how perfect she was for me. My dad nodded approvingly and even cracked a rare smile. But Jake? Jake had that same smirk he always wore when he wanted to get under my skin. "Congrats, little bro," he said, clapping me on the back a little too hard. "Didn't think you had it in you." It didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I had something Jake couldn't touch. Or so I thought. 2 weeks after I proposed, Jake called me out of the blue. He didn't usually reach out unless he needed something, so I was already on edge when I answered. "Hey man," he said casually. "You got a minute?" His tone wasn't alarming, but there was something smug beneath it, something I should have recognized. "What's up?" I asked, keeping it short. "Just thought you'd want to know," he said, letting out a small laugh. "I slept with her." I froze. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" I managed to choke out. "You heard me." He laughed again, like he just told me a harmless joke. "It was no big deal. Happened a couple of weeks ago, after your little proposal. She came by to talk about you, and well, one thing led to another." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. He had to be lying. "Why would you even tell me this?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "Because you deserve to know, bro," he said mockingly. "Honestly, you should be thanking me. I proved she's not worth it." Thanking him? My blood boiled at his audacity. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't remorseful. He was proud of what he'd done. And he thought I should be grateful. I could barely breathe as the weight of his betrayal sank in. I hung up without another word. I couldn't bear to hear his voice for another second. I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation in my head. Every word, every laugh, every smug tone, it was all a sickening echo that wouldn't stop. When I finally snapped out of it, anger took over. I drove to my parents' house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Jake still lived there, of course, lounging in the basement, while I was out building a life. The door swung open, and there he was, looking as smug as ever. "Hey, little bro," he said, leaning casually against the frame. I didn't give him time to say another word. I shoved him backward into the house, my voice trembling with rage. "You think this is funny? You think you can just ruin my life and laugh about it?" He stumbled, his cocky grin faltering for the first time. "Whoa, calm down," he said, holding up his hands like he was the victim. "It's not like she's innocent. She came to me, remember?" Hearing him try to shift the blame only made things worse. I lunged at him, and before I knew it, we were grappling in the living room. It wasn't a clean fight. I wasn't thinking straight, but I landed a solid punch that sent him sprawling onto the floor. Our mother's voice broke through the chaos. "Daniel, stop!" she screamed, rushing into the room. She turned to Jake, who was wiping blood from his lip. "What's going on?" Jake, always quick to play the victim, put on his best wounded expression. I told him something he needed to know, he said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. I was just being honest. Honest? I spat, glaring at him. You slept with my fiancée, and you laughed about it. The color drained from my mother's face. She looked at Jake, then back at me, as if she couldn't decide who to believe. Jake, tell me that's not true. But Jake didn't deny it. Instead, he shrugged, his cocky grin creeping back. What can I say? She wasn't happy with him. I just gave her what she wanted. My mother gasped, covering her mouth in shock. How could you? She started, but Jake cut her off. Oh, please, Mom. Don't act all high and mighty. It's not like they were married yet. I couldn't take it anymore. You're a coward, I said, my voice shaking. You've spent your whole life tearing me down because you can't stand the idea of me having something better than you. But you know what? You don't win this time. I turned and left, slamming the door behind me. When I got back to my apartment, she was waiting for me, tears streaming down her face. He told you, didn't he? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I'm sorry, she said, breaking down. It was a mistake. I was confused, and save it. I snapped. I don't want to hear your excuses. She begged me to forgive her, saying it hadn't meant anything, that she still wanted to marry me. But her words were empty. How could I ever trust her, or anyone, again? The days after the betrayal were a blur of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. I cut off all contact with her immediately, deleted her number, blocked her on every platform, and returned the ring to the jeweler. She tried to reach out, of course, but there was nothing left to say. Jake wasn't done, though. He kept twisting the knife, calling me with fake apologies or smug comments like, "You'll thank me one day, bro." I stopped taking his calls. My parents, however, were a different story. My mother begged me to forgive Jake, insisting he didn't know what he was doing and that family is all we have. My father, for once, stayed quiet, a deep frown etched on his face. He didn't defend Jake, but he didn't condemn him either, which hurt almost as much. I decided I needed space from all of them. I packed a bag and moved in with a friend for a while, someone who had always been in my corner. They helped me process everything, reminding me that I didn't owe Jake, or anyone else, my forgiveness. Word got out about what Jake had done, and for the first time, his golden boy image began to crack. Friends distanced themselves, and the relatives who once praised him as the perfect son stopped inviting him to family events. It was small comfort, but it was something. As for me, I poured all my energy into my work. I threw myself into every project, every deadline, determined to prove, to myself more than anyone else, that I could rebuild my life without their shadows looming over me. It's been 2 years since that night. I've cut ties with Jake completely and only see my parents at major family gatherings, where I keep our conversations polite and brief. I've learned to find happiness in other areas of my life, in the friendships I've nurtured, in my career, and in the quiet peace of knowing I've removed the toxic influences from my life. I still think about what happened. Of course. Some wounds don't heal easily. But I've come to realize that their betrayal says more about them than it ever did about me. Jake and I will never be brothers again, and I'm okay with that. I don't need him, just like I didn't need his shadow all those years. For the first time, my life feels like it's truly my own.